What's up YouTube, it's your boy JP's on the keys, and it's too easy about the video today. I did get a request to do the 7 ages of America and the presidents behind them. This is part 1. I'm going to do all 3 parts, but let's just get to it.
The United States of America stands among the titans of history's greatest civilizations and empires. Nearly twice the size of Rome's empire and bearing the most powerful military the world has ever known, it is suffice to say the US deserves its rank among the greats. But to bring about such success in merely 2.5 centuries of existence, this nation must certainly have had superior leaders capable of turning a ragtag confederation of backwater colonies into the mighty country it would later become. Politically, the United States is a 2-party presidential and constitutional republic in which the people elect a slate of representatives who in turn elect the president. The US has had dozens of admirable men grace the office of presidency, but of these men only 7 or perhaps 8 rank among the nation's best and most impactful. Men who, whether you admire them or not, agree or disagree with their characters or policies, dramatically altered the history of America in lasting ways. This is not to say the remaining presidents have had no impact upon the nation, nor that they have played no contributing role to the success of the talented 7 and the political periods they created, but that these exceptional men stood apart from their peers in personally driving forward these bold new directions for the country, which utterly redefined the nation as we knew it. When I first set about making this video, I expected it to be lengthy, and it's certainly proven to be that and then some. So we will be breaking it down into 3 parts, and there is no better place to begin than with the original architect of the nation, the founding father who first took the reins of the presidential office and set the standard for all who would follow, George Washington. In his ambitious youth, Washington, a well-born lad from Virginia, sought to make a name for himself wherever he could, eventually finding an opportunity in the military where he would achieve his first taste of fame by delivering crucial correspondence between British and French forces over disputed lands in the American Midwest. He'd be made a lieutenant colonel immediately following.
You know what's crazy? I also heard that George Washington, he kind of set the precedent. He set like the precedent for like the example for like 2-term presidencies. Like he could have easily ran as long as he wanted to, but he decided to retire after 8 years. You know what I'm saying? So then it set the precedent. It was a tradition, and everyone became a president. Everyone was a 2-term president, or at least 2 terms was the limit. Where you just decided, okay, I've been here long enough. I'm overstaying my welcome. I'm gonna leave until FDR comes, and then he served for like 37 years. I know it's like 12. He was actually gonna do a 4th term, but then he passed away, which is when then the 22nd Amendment comes up, and now it's only a 2-term limit for every president. So you can only serve once. You can serve twice, but if you can serve twice, but if you have to only do 4 years each time. Just like Mr. Trump trying to run again, and I think Grover Cleveland served twice in 2 different times. I'm pretty sure he did.
Being young, naive, and somewhat stubborn, Washington was naturally overconfident in his abilities, something which this promotion and fame only reinforced. As a consequence, he initially stumbled in his new role. The first of these stumbles came in attacking a smaller grouping of French soldiers at the recommendation of a native ally, who may have simply been attempting to play the French and British against each other. Knowing that the French would soon strike back for his actions, Washington would proceed to place his faith in the shoddily constructed and poorly located Fort Necessity to defend against the French retaliation, only to be captured there not long after. Washington's actions would have directly triggered the French and Indian War and brought some serious controversy to his name, earning him a reputation as an overly ambitious child who lacked the experience necessary to hold any commanding rank. Washington, who had briefly ascended to the rank of colonel, was now facing a potential demotion, and in an attempt to avoid such shame upon his title, he instead resigned from military command. Realizing he couldn't simply rely upon natural skill and good fortune to bring him success, he was brought to face the fact that he knew very little, and if he was to succeed, would need to learn far more or risk sullying his name even further. That opportunity would come in a following British campaign against the French, in which Washington would not hold a commanding role but a position as an aide, getting a first-hand look at how a seasoned military leader conducted himself and operated the various mechanisms of war.
I keep forgetting that when they say British against the French, like, and certainly the British colonies were just overseas. Like, they were still fighting on the British side. This is way before the revolution, because I always think like British. When did George Washington fight for the British? Then it's like, oh, this is before Revolution and all this stuff. So I was just like, I was making sure, because I was like, what?
Eventually, Washington's commanding officer would fall in battle and his men would become chaotically scattered. Knowing that inaction would have led to an utter massacre, Washington hastily applied the skills he had observed by reorganizing the remaining soldiers and directing an effective retreat. This act of heroism helped him to restore his image and regain his commanding role in the military, though that being said, it was still a position he had to fight to maintain, until he again resigned and turned his ambitions toward achieving glory as a successful plantation owner and politician in his native Virginia instead. Washington had inherited a great deal of land from his brother Lawrence and almost immediately took to expanding the property and building upon the manor itself. He studied intensely a variety of farming methods and put them to test, again learning from trial and error. Washington's eventual marriage to a woman named Martha Custis would allow him to inherit her late husband Daniel Parke Custis's vast estate, greatly increasing his own land holdings, which he would later double along with those he'd acquired from his brother.
So he basically, Washington is a finesser, like not in a bad way, but the thing is, he took what he got and he built upon it though, so you can't really say it's just, he inherited it. Well, he inherited it and he built upon it. Like, he got his brother's land and he tripled, he heavily expanded the land, and then when he married his wife Martha, her brother estate, he inherited her brother's estate, then he tripled the value of the estate. So you cannot say that he didn't just turn it. He turned water into wine, I'll tell you that. So hey.
Ultimately making him one of the colony's wealthiest men. Washington's wealth in turn earned him a greater presence and influence in local society, which when paired with his military fame allowed him to pursue a successful political career where he would apply the lessons he had taken from his military duty. Quickly, it appeared Washington was developing into a well-rounded statesman, but having so deeply rooted himself in his community, Washington could not help but be an active voice against British policy which hurt colonial business and liberty. In time, Washington became one of the leading organizers of colonial unity between the 13 colonies, helping to establish the Continental Congress and personally training militiamen before ultimately being appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, based upon his popularity across the colonies, demonstration of loyalty to the colonial cause, and well-recorded military experience. Washington would again stumble in military duty, finding himself repeatedly forced to retreat from the better trained and organized Imperials. However, it was expected this much would occur, and instead of wage a conventional campaign against the Imperials, Washington's methods forced Britain to overextend itself in ultimately fruitless or indecisive encounters, allowing the colonials to pick off vulnerable targets and confound Imperial efforts to resupply or regroup. Washington's strategy ultimately amounted to denying Britain the satisfaction of definitive
crossing the Delaware River. And it's always good to see this photo because I am a Delawarean. I am a Delaware resident, and just seeing this photo of him cross the Delaware River, like, dang, George Washington crossed the Delaware River right next to my state. So that's great, you know what I'm saying? I always feel good about that.
Progress and waiting for a moment to bring down a large enough target that would greatly cripple Britain's morale. These tactics would ultimately prove highly effective, and in time the revolution would be won. Washington, feeling he had sufficiently served his purpose, resigned as commander-in-chief and left the nation in the hands of the Continental Congress, even despite speculation that he would maintain control and establish a military regime. Washington had seemingly hoped to retire from political life and return to his plantation, but again he'd be called upon to lend his voice to decide how the states would be organized. Immediately following the American victory, the nation was left highly decentralized and its government was effectively powerless without a single executive commander to lead the states as one. With many feeling there was no better man suited to lead and preserve the Union than the very man who had been doing so throughout the Revolution, Washington ultimately found himself elected president despite his hesitations, receiving majority support across every state, bringing an end to the American Confederation, and giving rise to the Federation of the United States. Upon his ascension, Washington was essentially given a blank slate with which to define the presidency as he saw fit. This placed a tremendous burden upon him as he understood any action he took would set a precedent for his successors, and so he took it upon himself to tread very carefully in all presidential matters, making every effort to appear nonpartisan and strictly pragmatic. Though Washington famously served without a party affiliation, partially because no parties had yet been established, he did favor the soon-to-emerge Federalist faction, who even prior to the party's foundation had been the leading force behind American independence, and soon stood on a principle of liberty through noble rule. The Federalists had largely been comprised of Anglo-Americans living in long-established coastal or plantation-based communities within the North and Middle States, as opposed to the Scottish and Scotch-Irish populations which tended to occupy parts of the frontier in the central and southern states. This latter population would go on to form the core support base of the opposition party, the Democratic Republicans. As a faction, the Federalists aimed to establish a powerful central government and gradually integrate the states into a closer union, doing away with state and local autonomy to create a stronger, more cohesive national identity and interstate policy. Beyond this, the Federalists aimed to promote a system of meritocratic hierarchy in which the most successful and intelligent of society held the greatest political power, as there was a sense that the average citizen lacked a deep understanding of politics and was too easily corruptible by power, wealth, etc.
This is why in the Civil War, the North took the South. They took them lightly. You cannot lie and say the North did not take the South lightly, because it was already a stereotype that these people in the South are nothing but just dumb. They're just dumb country hicks. They're just stupid farmers. All they know how to do is in agriculture and own slaves. That's all they know how to do. We're so sophisticated. We have factories. We have industrialization. We have mechanization. We are better than them automatically. And then the war lasted longer than they thought it would have. See, the only reason I think I heard that the South was trying to get help from France. So the fact that if that would have greatly shifted the tide of the Civil War, if the South was able to get the help from the French. Like, just think about that. Like, it's already bad blood because the colonies, when they were British, already beat France in the late 1700s. And then you come back 80 years later, now it's like the same colonies trying to go against the northern people, the higher ups. Oh yeah, we're definitely gonna fight against them. You feel what I'm saying? So yeah, I see where the stereotype comes from, but they underestimated them definitely.
In essence, the Federalists aimed to create an aristocracy invested with the duty of preserving liberty for all citizens to secure it from both the popular tide and the tyranny of the few, holding themselves to the standard of placing the Union's interest and the Constitution above all else. It was a system of order and long-term planning which the nation easily owes its early survival to. Washington's administration would have seen the US isolate itself from international affairs until it stood secure in its wealth, military might, organization, and national unity, all of which the US then presently lacked, and without which it might again succumb to foreign domination. This administration allowed for beneficial relations to be forged with Britain, for a national bank to be established, for the creation of the Supreme Court as a third branch of government, and for the military to be reformed and expanded. As the Federalists looked forward, they saw America set to become the freest nation the world had yet seen. But it would do so wisely so that such freedom is that which lasts through the centuries and not merely a blip of pleasure which fizzles into anarchic chaos. Washington's favoritism toward Federalist policy and Alexander Hamilton, the party's founder and leader, would ultimately lead to a schism within his support base, with fervent anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson establishing his own party in opposition. Washington and other founders initially opposed the creation of political parties, recognizing them as divisive and obstructive, yet despite these concerns most accepted that the formation of parties was likely inevitable given how useful partisanship is in attracting and holding mass public support. It's almost akin to a prisoner's dilemma in which whoever establishes a party will automatically gain a reliable support base over those who do not. Thus, it is in your interest to create your party before your opponent does.
Exactly, because listen, when people have a cause and when people have a reason to be upset or to be emotionally moved, you can control them. That's why political parties are so great, because they're divisive. They're ways to control people. You gotta think about that. You know that most people in this party, that most people who are conservative have kind of the same type of views. Most people who are liberal have the same type of views. You rarely get those people who are just like neutral or in the middle, or just they go along. They believe both of liberal things and both of conservative. It's either you're left or you're right. That's all it is. And that's always a great way to divide people, because you can always attack the other side, because the other sides hate each other, and you can use that to get people to do what you want.
Despite his best efforts, Washington could not prevent the partisan division he feared would take root, and it would not be long before the anti-Federalist media began its years-long tirade against Washington's administration. Traitor, monarchist, and pro-British were all just a handful of the political accusations made on Washington, and it said the stress of this constant media hatred was a motivating factor for the president to not pursue a third term. Political division soon spilled over into foreign policy. Washington, knowing the country required a calm period to temper and stabilize, took every measure to ensure the United States remained isolated from foreign affairs and secure from attempted subversions by foreign actors. When France's Revolution broke out, there was a sense that the United States would be a kindred ally in the name of republicanism and support French Republicans against their monarchist opponents. The French, after all, supported the colonists against Britain, so it seemed only just that the US reciprocate. But beyond American...
Yeah, I revert the statement, because I said the French were against, they were fighting against the French. They were revert. I'll take that back. All right. Hey, I admit when I'm wrong, okay? 'Cause I ain't the best. I'm not no historian. I know a little bit, but I'm not a historian. So,
limitations in military capability, there was a complexity to this which is easily overlooked. Plainly, it was not the French Republicans who supported the Americans, but the French kingdom, whose leader the French Republicans had just executed, along with several military officers who actually participated in the American War for Independence. As far as Washington's administration was concerned, these men who had not broken away to form their own country but overthrew and executed their king did not represent the France which aided the US in the past, and did not represent the Republican ideals which the US stood upon. This became a partisan issue as the radical Democratic Republicans threw their support behind the French Republicans and labeled Federalist denial of support to the French as a betrayal of Republican values. In the end, Washington would reject overtures for a Franco-American alliance built on ideology, which embittered the French and now raised the possibility of war between the two. Foreign wars aside, Washington had another conflict to deal with right at home. The Northwest Territory, which Britain had transferred to the US following the Revolution, was largely occupied by natives, who, though cooperative with Britain, refused to acknowledge new American ownership of the land. Continued native aggression against American settlers here and in the South, despite repeated attempts to negotiate peaceful coexistence or a redrawing of the borders, would ultimately force Washington to adopt aggressive measures against the Amerindians, securing the region but souring ties between the two, the latter regularly becoming a pawn of Britain in attempts to undermine American advancement. That aside, altogether, Washington's early presidency gave muscle to the skeleton which was the fledgling American government, seeing to the establishment, expansion, and operation of crucial institutions and positions in the fields of national finance, defense, and beyond, demonstrating by example how the government was to function. Washington would lay the foundation for a subsequent Federalist administration under John Adams, who successfully expanded upon Washington's work and that of the Federalist Party, all the while preventing the outbreak of major wars both domestic and abroad. Adams built the military even further and prevented the outbreak of a major war with France, only needing wage a series of minor but successful naval skirmishes during what was known as the Quasi-War. Adams openly recognized that had he initiated war with France, it would have likely guaranteed him re-election, as it would have helped to bring the party together at a time when anti-French sentiment was rising, and it would have turned public opinion against the pro-French opposition. However, he also knew America was still tempering, and while the states might emerge victorious, the conflict was sure to leave the country exhausted and vulnerable. Now was not a time to risk America for petty politics, he thought, but Adams might just come to regret that decision, as America, his America, that of the Federalist Party and of Washington, was about to come to an end, as the United States would soon make its first radical change. Since the beginning of the Washington administration, and even before its foundation as a party, the Federalist faction had enjoyed reliable support from across the country, most especially from the upper and middle classes and from those of English descent. However, as voter turnout began rising, much of the party's popular support hinged upon Washington and his recommendation of Federalist candidates for positions of government. Upon Washington's passing in 1799, things quickly changed. Many amongst the masses had already developed reservations toward the Federalists, even regardless of Washington's support, thanks in great part to the non-stop media accusations which painted the Federalists out to be a movement intent on bringing about a new monarchical order or turning the US into a puppet of Britain. The Federalist Party and the men behind it seemingly held a strong track record for success, but it came at a price which sometimes frustrated the masses, be it a limiting of their political power, the creation of new taxes, expansion of federal influence, and what have you. But on the opposing side was a promise to preserve the prosperity the Federalists had created while doing away with all their unpleasant costs.
So it's just like an opposite. So like I can see how the people are mad because they're thinking like, bruh, we fought the biggest army in the world. We beat, at the time, we beat the biggest army in the world. And now here y'all come, y'all rich random people coming here trying to establish all these rules, trying to put all these taxes on here. You just like Britain now. What, taxes? We just did away with taxes. Y'all, we dumped thousands of gallons of tea in the ocean because of taxes. We fought with soldiers because of taxes. They protested because of taxes. They were taxing their sugar, they were taxing their stamps, they were taxing their paper, they were taxing they made it to where British troops could just quarter in your house and you couldn't do anything about it. Now we done went through all this oppression from Britain. Here y'all come trying to establish all this stuff, trying to limit people's rights. Like, I can understand why people are mad, though. Yeah.
Did the United States not stand for equality among men, many wondered? Why should this minority of the population, regardless of their qualifications, hold such power over us, the working majority? Why must we pay taxes? Did we not fight a war against taxation? And what's this about federal government? What business is it of mine what happens in Massachusetts when I live in Virginia? To Thomas Jefferson, the Federalists were not representative of true republicanism, but aristocrats seeking to establish a one-party unitary state under the guise of having no parties at all. Truly, such an expression does seemingly demand either that laws be put in place to obstruct natural efforts at factional organization, or to weed out any rival factions. A concern raised only further by President Adams' Sedition Acts, which aimed to criminalize the making of false critical statements against the government.
Censorship. The first acts of censorship in the United States. The Sedition Bill. Now you can't talk about the government anyway or you're going to get thrown in jail. But the thing is, like, that's subjective. That's almost tyranny. That's really just like a tyrant would run his government, like an autocracy. You can't say anything bad about the government, or we're gonna throw you in jail.
Jefferson feared the rise of an oppressive government and stood intent on overthrowing the Federalists without spilling a drop of blood, to achieve revolution through the vote, and so he would through the so-called Revolution of 1800, a name commonly attributed to the election of the same year, an election which through mass rallying and tactical media exposure attracted the highest voter turnout yet seen and swung the election well into Democratic-Republican control, where it would remain for nearly 3 decades, causing the Federalist Party to eventually wither and die. Jefferson too was born to a well-to-do Virginia family, but found himself quite quickly thrust into academics. He proved exceptionally skilled in understanding and retaining information, but was prone to distraction and extravagance, famously spending the majority of his first year in college partying and compensating for it by doubling his workload the following year. Unlike Washington, whose education was more lackluster but bolstered by first-hand experiences as well as trial and error, Jefferson drew his information from a bounty of literature, most especially the fields of law, politics, and philosophy, famously writing that literature was his life and that he, quote, could not live without books. It is from this that Jefferson developed a reputation as an unrealistic dreamer upon his entry into politics, often proposing radical ideas which simply weren't accepted by his more grounded and experienced contemporaries. Despite this, Jefferson was given the honor, by John Adams mind you, of drafting the Declaration of Independence, though of course edits would be made to prevent Jefferson from sending a final draft riddled with philosophical ramblings and excessively radical language. Jefferson played a relatively minor role during the War for Independence, mostly remaining in his native Virginia, working on the local state constitution and other post-war legislation while also serving as governor. In the war's aftermath, Jefferson would be made a minister to France, where he would remain until the outbreak of the Revolution, during which he made clear his support for the French Republicans before being called back to the US and being made Washington's Secretary of State, where he would clash with Federalist Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Now, Jefferson's ideology was one driven by a desire for egalitarian liberty, to decentralize the country for the purpose of preserving local freedoms from the rule of a far-off and disassociated federal capital, and to place an equal degree of political power in the hands of the common landholding man. Certainly, Jefferson believed, as did the Federalists, that all citizens of the Union ought be entitled to equal protections, but power was something he believed was best placed not in the hands of a very wealthy elite, nor the uneducated masses, but in those of the agrarian yeoman class, farmers who were self-sufficient and free of need from governmental or outside support, individuals who had a vested interest in preserving freedom because they themselves, through their tireless efforts, were personally free.
Basically, all the slave owners in the South. basically what that means, boiled down to it, but basically all the people who grew crops and the slave owners. That's what that meant. Like, who else in the South owned hundreds of acres of land if you did not either have crops or slaves? Like, you know what I'm saying?
And through their property possessed a tangible stake in the country. Ironically, Jefferson could not fully live up to this standard himself, falling into debt for much of his life and often spending his money frivolously whilst attempting to sustain himself as a mere tobacco farmer. Truly, his interests and manner were those of an aristocrat despite his criticism of them. He enjoyed fancy food, philosophical literature, and hours of writing and research. His was a life of luxury and not the modest fantasy he believed it to be. While this does speak poorly of Jefferson's character, it should not fully dismiss his ideals, which did carry some weight, and would see successful incorporation to the policies of future administrations, which would eventually make of the agrarian South the dominant political force in the country. As mentioned earlier, Jefferson was able to draw in an unprecedented voter turnout through aggressive campaigning, appealing to the common man, and utilizing a tightly connected network of newspaper publishers to spin a message and repeatedly circulate it among the masses, outperforming the Federalists, who carried support from over twice as many publishers at the time, but lacked Jefferson's level of control over the narrative and his party's identity of standing for the common man. Thomas Jefferson would win the election of 1800 and proceed to reorient the course of the country. Immediately, Jefferson's victory was met with much fear and concern from the opposition. Up until this point, the Federalist Party had been the establishment, and this transition of power from one party to another would be the first of its kind in U.S. history. President Adams, before leaving office, would attempt to hinder the incoming administration from radically changing the country in hopes that the Federalists might take power back in a few years, though that would never happen. Some in the North would later go as far as to propose secession, but this too never came to pass. In a matter of weeks, the radical who refused to attend Washington's funeral became the highest executive in the land, but his movement did not stop there. Up until the election of 1800, the Democratic Republicans had been a minor faction in Congress, never carrying more than 55% of seats. But following Jefferson's ascendancy, they'd maintained a consecutive supermajority for 25 years.
Isn't that usually how it is? One guy, you notice how a president moves in, and then they elect a bunch of Senate members or people in Congress seats that identify with his politics. And even though the new president might be of a different political affiliation, his seat members are still there from his presidency. So if the new president tries to pass anything, it's going to be a harder chance to go through because the new president's ideas don't align with the overall House's with the Congress's ideas. You feel what I'm saying? Of course, you got to get the old system out with the old, in with the new.
There was nothing the Federalists could do to reverse course. The country was now in the hands of the Democratic Republicans, and it would stay that way until they themselves died out as a party. As you might expect, Federalist policies were widely undone, decentralizing the nation, reducing federal power, and shrinking the military to a purely defensive scale. However, as president, Jefferson also went on to establish West Point Military Academy, significantly reduce the national debt, and acquire the territory of Louisiana from France. The party agenda would be carried on and refined by 5 subsequent administrations, those of Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, the first 2 having served dual terms while the latter barely achieved his first term. Madison had been Jefferson's moderate co-founder of the Democratic-Republican Party and carried forward the establishment agenda well until the end of the 1812 war, when he began incorporating Federalist governmental policies into his own, now realizing how necessary a strong military economy and central government was to the security of the nation. Madison had, after all, regularly fraternized with the Federalists and remained closer to Washington than Jefferson had, and so this did not come as a great surprise, but it did foreshadow what was to come later down the line. Monroe is another remarkable president who, though belonging to Jefferson's Democratic-Republican era, deserves to be more thoroughly discussed for both his own unique character and contributions. Monroe had a fairly modest upbringing, well off financially, but not without the demands of constant labor. Growing up, he'd spend 4 times as long working his family farm than he would in school. That is, until his parents passed away, forcing him to take on farming full-time in order to support himself and his siblings at age 16, the same age at which Jefferson would have gone off to college to party with his peers and professors. Monroe's uncle would eventually lend him a hand so that he could have a proper college education, but upon the outbreak of the Revolution, Monroe placed his education on hold to instead fight for a cause he believed in.
I like that. It's hard-working dude. Dude fought hard to support his family, and then his people showed him some hard work. You know what? He said, F school, I'm going to serve my country.
He'd be severely injured in battle, but soon recovered and returned to combat before finally returning home to continue his studies, coming under the tutelage of guess who? Thomas Jefferson. Monroe was the absolute image of the self-sufficient agrarian American Jefferson had envisioned. Monroe was smart, strong, independent, loyal, and dedicated. However, unlike Jefferson, who had never suffered from want and dreamed of a simpler life, Monroe grew up a laborer, knew how unglamorous such an existence could be, and dreamed of joining the upper class instead of squandering his talents toiling in a field for the rest of his life. Perhaps that was enough for most men, but Monroe's dreams were far bigger. He wanted to go as far as his skills could possibly take him. With Jefferson's wealth and status, along with his praising of the agrarian man, the two would develop a special relationship.
See? It's a burning desire. Like, when you come from nothing, you want to do everything. You want to be like, yo, I can reach whatever, because I never thought I would get this big. Because then you have Jefferson, Adams, Jefferson, Washington, Adams. All 3 of these men come from wealth. So, like, if you're already born with everything, what are you striving for? You feel what I'm saying? Obviously, maybe power, but after power, what else is it? You feel what I'm saying?
Monroe certainly fumbled in his earlier political years, but he would stand by Jefferson's side through it all, and like Washington, he watched closely and learned. As president, Monroe, recognizing that the Federalists had withered into a non-threat, began to more drastically redraw the lines of Democratic Republicanism to incorporate additional Federalist policies. Under his administration, the nation moved to strengthen the federal government's authority so as to allow for the financing and construction of national projects and interstate infrastructure. This would attract former members of the Federalist Party to join what had been the sole ruling party of the country for 2 decades by that point. This had in fact been an active effort by Monroe to drive the Federalists into extinction and eliminate political parties altogether, now that the country was thoroughly entrenched in Democratic-Republican ideology. Beyond this, the implementation of the Monroe Doctrine would have made clear the U.S.'s support for anti-imperial Republican movements across North America, warning off European powers from attempting additional colonization efforts and in turn asserting the role of the United States as the dominant power on the continent, setting the stage for greater American control of the Western Hemisphere in the near future. But just as it appeared that democratic republicanism had won and united the nation under a shared set of values, the following election would prove just how close the Union was coming to its next great shift. The US of Z thanks you for watching.
Hey, this series is fire. I can't even cap. But yeah, this is very interesting. I'm not gonna lie to you. But thank you. Shout out to US of Z. Was it Loser Z? What's the channel called? Shout out to shout out to this channel, bro. Shout out to the channel. I'm gonna leave a link so you can watch this video, so you can subscribe to him. Thank you again. Please be safe. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Also, don't forget to turn on my post notifications if you haven't already. Share my videos. Thank you. Please be safe. Have a great day. I'm out. Peace.